Kia ora. Welcome to Conversations with Wāhine, brought to you by the Wellington branch of the National Council of Women, New Zealand. Harita and I have another esteemed guest on the show, Nicola Willis. Nicola is a List MP based in Wellington. She entered Parliament in April 2018, and a modern-day powerhouse with a long list of achievements. Nicola is now National's Deputy Leader, spokesperson for Finance and Social Investment. She is National's candidate for Ōhāriu electorate in the upcoming general election. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, particularly as the election campaign begins to ramp up. I know you have a lot to do today, so we will get straight into it. But firstly, how's the campaign going so far? Is it as wild as you expected?
Oh, look, I'm really enjoying it. The great thing about election campaigns is suddenly everyone is as interested in politics as I am all the time. It's wonderful being able to talk with voters, go and knock on their doors, meet them at public meetings and talk about the issues that matter to all of us and national solutions for the problems facing the country. So I'm loving it.
Great. Sounds like a lot of fun. Must be pretty exhausting as well. Something I have noticed in particular, just when watching particularly the media speak to politicians, it's been quite interesting to notice the difference between how men and women are treated and also how men and women feel like they have to behave when they speak as well. One of the main disparities I have noticed is how females have to use their body language in a much more socially agreeable manner, such as smiling, pleasantries, and I notice it particularly in uncomfortable situations, whereas I find the males, I feel like they feel this pressure to be a lot more serious and quite a bit more astute. As a deputy leader of the opposition, standing alongside a male leader, do you feel that you're treated differently to Chris Luxon by either your peers, the public, and the media?
It's a really interesting set of observations that you've shared. And I have to be honest, it's not something I've reflected on very deeply, but I will now. I'll now be very alert to it, I'm sure. Look, I think that one of the things I do notice is that I am by nature a pretty assertive person. I have opinions and I take pleasure in stating them. And sometimes people will describe me in words that I think relate to that in my gender. So, that I'm strident or I'm aggressive. And I sometimes think to myself, no, I'm just a feisty woman with an opinion. So, look, that happens. And I guess the other thing that I notice is there are a lot of people and their hearts are in such good places, but who really want to give me advice about what I'm wearing, my hair, my makeup. And I just can't help but think that men with their boring suit tie combos probably don't get as much feedback of that sort.
That's another thing, right? A lot of politicians, and I think Jacinda Ardern once spoke about this, that the extra time they spend behind the scenes to get ready for their public appearances is so much more than their male counterparts. So they could wear the same suit 3 days in a row, no one would even notice because all their suits look the same anyway. And whereas if a female politician hasn't worn makeup that day, everyone notices, and people don't take into account how much time it actually takes to get ready for all of that.
Yeah, look, put it this way, with 4 kids and a big job, I've become very efficient at the 5-minute makeup. It's fair to say I don't wash my hair every day, people. So I won't give you more details, but there are shortcuts and I take every single one that I guess where I come from on it is you don't want your appearance to be a distraction from what you're saying, because actually I want people focused on the ideas and the arguments. And so I try to the extent possible not to let my appearance be a distraction.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So you studied journalism as part of your tertiary education, and obviously we all know how journalists and politics work together, or sometimes don't work together. And while journalism is an important part of our democratic process, what are your thoughts on the manner in which we interrogate our politicians or question our politicians today? And if it was up to you, how would journalists and politicians work together for an open and constructive campaign?
Yeah, that's a really thoughtful question. And it's one that I think I have quite an interesting perspective on, in that my mother was a journalist. She was actually a press gallery journalist. So when I come to work at Parliament, I walk down the press gallery corridor past a photo of her when she was a journalist. And she's heavily pregnant in one of the photos, and the pregnancy is me.
Full circle.
Yeah, and she was on that side of things, and she was one of the few women in the press gallery when she was there. And now I'm there as a politician. I have a lot of respect for the role of journalists. They are there both to share information with the public that is relevant to your decision making, but also to hold us to account. I think sometimes is that journalists are so focused on the hold to account bit that the public don't always have an opportunity to first hear from the politician what the idea is or what their argument is before the interrogation begins. And if it's one plea that I would have for all journalists, it's let us answer the question and then do the follow-up. But look, I would say that I'm a politician, and they would say back, well, they're just trying to evade answering the question and we have to interrupt to get the answer. So I can see both sides of that story.
I find it interesting because there is a general assumption that politicians tend to sideline questions and avoid the real answer. I wonder how much of that really has to do with the fact that they're not always actually given an opportunity to fully answer the question.
Yeah, look, I think it's probably a bit of both. But I think what also happens is sometimes we don't give the answer that a journalist wants. And it doesn't matter how many times you ask the question sometimes. I'm not going to say what the journalist wants me to say. And so I think that can be very uncomfortable for viewers at home to watch, because it feels like it's going nowhere. And people, I think, find that conflict quite difficult to watch. And I sometimes think to myself, how could we make this a more pleasant experience for the person at home who's had a really busy day, who's got lots going on in their life, and they're just trying to tune in and get an idea of something. To the extent possible, I try and communicate in ways that allow people to get the gist without having to have studied all of the parliamentary Hansard and budget updates for the last 6 years.
Yeah, it is a shame, really, because the trust that the public have in the media and politicians have just been consistently dropping. And I think COVID was probably I think it was a huge reason for why it's dropping even more. What are your thoughts on that, especially as far as misinformation and disinformation is coming out? Do you feel like there's any way around the issue that we have as far as media and politicians go? Is there any way where we can actually build some trust?
Look, I push back when I have members of the public from time to time say to me, look, you can't trust anything in the media. Certainly don't share that view. And I think as responsible actors in civil society, we as politicians actually have some responsibility to uphold faith in the institutions of the fourth estate or the media. But equally, the media have responsibilities to ensure that they are striking balance and they're not taking a narrow worldview. I think we're living in the time where direct communication via social media channels, via person-to-person contact, has a real primacy to it, because so many people are going in different directions for their news and information. Whereas in the old days, everyone sat down to watch the news together or read the newspaper in the morning. Now people get their news on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. They might flick on News Hub, they might flick on TVNZ, or they might never do that. And so the sources of information are varied. And as politicians, we really value getting our message directly to voters. And that's why we do still door knocking in campaigns. You know, we're doing the same thing that we have done for decades, literally turning up on the doorstep to say, what are your questions? I'm here to answer them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was reading today that social media is actually the third most trusted resource when it comes to news now. Leading on from that anyway, because I know you don't have a lot of time. Although you don't have any previous qualifications in finance before taking on your current role, you served as both research and policy advisor for Bill English and then senior advisor for John Key in 2008. How prepared were you for coming into the role of National's finance spokesperson during a cost of living crisis? And what kind of support and education did you get on the job?
Yeah, look, I still have moments where I think to myself, wow, I did not expect to be here. And I'll say to anyone watching, I think sometimes people think they look at people in roles like this and they think she must have had a really good 5-year plan and ticked all the boxes on the way. But my life has certainly not been like that. I had never dreamed that I would be in this position. But instead, my life has, I think, unfolded as a series of doors that have opened and that I've eagerly leapt through. And I think what has been consistent in my life is that I have sought out opportunities. When I've had them, I've worked really hard. I've never been the smartest person in the room, but I've always thought, well, I'm willing to work an extra hour so I can keep up with the person who is. And working with Bill English and John Key for me was a real apprenticeship, not just in how does Parliament work, how do you read a budget, how do you put together costings and a policy, but also in how do you build a team, how do you create a connection with people, how do you draw things together into a coherent whole. And I watched them do that successfully. I learned a lot from it. I made my own observation that I wanted to go out into the real world and leave the parliamentary complex to get a better sense of New Zealand. And I did that for several years before then making that call to return here and give it a go as a representative myself.
So now on to some of the announcements that National has been making in the lead up to the elections. In lieu of your announcement to reduce inflation and your plan to adjust the tax brackets for New Zealanders to compensate for the rising inflation, are you intending to adjust tax brackets in line with the current inflation levels or National's predicted CPI once you come into office?
Well, what we've done is we've set out in our tax plan an adjustment to the tax brackets, which somewhat compensates for the massive inflation New Zealanders have experienced in the past few years. It doesn't compensate for all of the inflation. What we've sought to do is put together a tax plan that's responsible and that we can fund without having to borrow, because we know that the economy is in a really difficult spot and we wanted to put our tax plan together responsibly. We've really targeted our tax package at what we've termed the squeeze middle. That's those New Zealanders who are working really hard, they're certainly not wealthy, but they often don't qualify for a lot of government support. So our package means that someone on a median income of $60,000 a year will be paying $50 less tax each fortnight. An average income household or couple will be $100 better off a fortnight. And a family with kids up to $250 better off a fortnight. So our plan goes some of the way to addressing the massive cost of living crisis that New Zealanders are encountering. I'm the first to say just offering tax relief is not enough. We also have to grow the economy responsibly so that we can lift people's incomes over time, and we can also ensure that we have the funding as a government to deliver really good frontline public services.
On the subject of the economy, I was watching a recent interview with Jack Tame, and it was regarding your plan to encourage productive growth in New Zealand via foreign investors and businesses, while using the foreign buyers tax to help fund tax cuts for New Zealanders. his stance, and I'm not sure how correct it was, however, it was that introducing new money to the system without increasing the supply of goods within the New Zealand economy would have inflationary results. You did respond with 2 points. First, you stated that New Zealanders may choose to save more and reduce their debt so that the money would not go straight into circulation, but you weren't actually given the chance to make your second point. How else are you planning to prevent new money from affecting our economy and triggering inflationary consequences?
Look, thank you for the opportunity. Look, making is that a lot of the New Zealanders who are really struggling with the cost of living at the moment have also experienced massive increases in their mortgages. So it is possible that some of their tax relief would go towards servicing their mortgage or debt reduction. But the second point I was making is, if you want to grow your economy as a whole and therefore grow its productive capacity, that is how much it can actually generate, that is one of the best things you can do to reduce pressure on inflation, and increase the supply of the economy. One of the barriers to that happening can be firms not having the investment they need to grow. And so what we have done is take a big picture look at the economy and said, well, where is it that investment in the future will come from so that we can grow the productive basis of the economy? And one of the things that's obvious around the world is that in some circumstances, a bit more overseas investment can ensure that you can have firms being able to grow from the small IT business to the big IT business, to invest in the new piece of really cool technology for the factory, and that sort of thing. And that over time increases productivity, and that's what we need as one of the things to take pressure off inflation.
Yeah, it must have been hard in a situation like that when you only have so little time. Is there really a need for New Zealanders to save more in order to reduce the inflationary results? Because it sounds like by what you're saying that it will help actually increase productivity anyway.
Well, look, what we've said in terms of inflation is that it's certainly time for the government to be much more disciplined about its own spending. The government itself has been borrowing a lot of money to spend. So one of the rules we set for our tax plan was we didn't want to be borrowing for it because we knew that that would even add pressure to inflation. At the same time, to get inflation under control, the government needs to control its own spending. It needs to get rid of some of the extra costs in the economy that get handed on in the form of higher prices. The Reserve Bank needs to do its job, and we've taken the stance that we think they should have a single focus on inflation busting, whereas the current government have widened their mandate somewhat and we think distracted them from that core task. And we also think it's important that you have a regulatory environment, as I say, that encourages productive growth and investment. So there's multiple steps to controlling inflation. What we know is this: inflation has been out of control for more than 2 years. It's been out of New Zealand's target range. It's still up at 6%, which is really high. And that tells us the government's current approach hasn't worked, and we think it's time for a different approach.
And further on from that, it said that National would also seek a further $400 million a year reduction in contractors and consultants procured by the public sector, and expects to save $2.1 billion over the next 4 years through scrapping a range of government programs like public transport subsidies for young people, Resource Management Act reforms, and fair pay agreements. While many New Zealanders have championed changes such as these, what are the downsides of them, and how is fair pay agreements and so forth a negative step for New Zealand?
Well, I start from the position that one of the core goals of our economic plan is to lift incomes for all New Zealanders. And we want to do that by having productive growth that sustains better incomes for all. One of the key reasons we want to reduce tax is so that people have more pay in their paycheck each fortnight. So we're very committed to that. The problem with the fair pay agreement legislation that the government's brought in is that it makes centralised wage bargaining compulsory for those who have it initiated in their sector or industry. And that can be really rigid in terms of applying an agreement which is the same across an entire sector, even though the needs of different employers, different businesses, different employees may really vary. So we just think that kind of centralized wage bargaining is a step back into the past. Whereas today, the typical employee really is looking for a good relationship with their employer in which they can have good terms and conditions. And yes, absolutely, we support them being able to join a union and negotiate that way. What we don't support is the compulsory centralised wage bargaining that the fair pay legislation promotes. In terms of some of the other initiatives that you have raised, our general philosophical view has been that the government in recent times has done a lot of ad hoc, smaller initiatives as a way of providing cost of living relief. So, for example, the concept of reducing GST on fruit and vegetables. We think the simplest way to give relief to people is through income tax reduction, because then people have the money. It doesn't go through a middleman. It doesn't have to go through a complex process or bureaucracy. None of it gets wasted on the way. Money goes straight to individuals and their families, and then they can choose what they use it for. Is it public transport? Is it that actually childcare is their main cost? They can make those choices, and we think often households are better to make those choices than the government making them for them.
Yeah, it sounds a fair bit more simplified. It'd be interesting to see how it turns out. Leading on from that, it's also said that National will redirect all future emissions trading scheme revenues to tax cuts. That money is currently earmarked for fighting climate change, but National says it would fund climate policy out of general budget allowances going forward. What does this mean for climate change targets? Will our general budget allowance be enough?
Yeah, look, we are very committed to fighting climate change. We signed up to the Zero Carbon Act because we think it's really important that there's agreement across the Parliament about the need for New Zealand to meet its international obligations and reduce its emissions. We also think New Zealand needs to be investing carefully to adapt to the reality of more extreme weather events, and that will mean that we have to invest in more resilient infrastructure into the future. So we will absolutely be making climate change investments. You will have seen, for example, in the selection campaign, we've already announced an initiative to turbocharge the building of an electric vehicle charging network across the country. We think that's important, enabling infrastructure so more people can use electric vehicles. What we also think is really significant for meeting our climate change goal is having an emissions trading scheme that works. The emissions trading scheme is there to put a price on pollution, and what we want it to do is be sustainable. In recent years, there have been real problems with the emissions trading scheme, and in part that's because the government has intervened to try and keep the price of it low. And we just don't think that makes sense. We think polluters need to see that high price. So what we've said is the current approach in which some of the funds raised by those polluter taxes have then been given back to companies in the form of subsidies and the like. We don't think that's the right approach. We think, in fact, the emissions trading scheme should stand on its own merits. New Zealanders should be confident that, yep, that may be adding to costs for polluters and others, but that's going back to you, New Zealanders, in the form of tax reduction, so you can get on board with that. And at the same time, the government will make the investments it needs to accelerate climate change action.
So essentially, it's not actually reducing money that really needs to go into climate change. It's taking away from the subsidies that are being sent to polluters as it stands.
Yeah, well, that's part of what it is. And for us, it's about making that emissions trading scheme more sustainable, because what we've been concerned about is if you have a situation where every time that emissions price goes higher, then all New Zealanders see is more polluters getting subsidies. They see them paying more for petrol, paying more for groceries as costs go up. Then they're not going to have confidence in that emissions trading scheme. It's going to find it difficult to sustain. We think it's more sustainable if the government is clear. Yes, there's a price on pollution, but you New Zealanders are getting that back.
Mm-hmm.
It's the polluters who should pay. What we want to see is the end of the use of fossil fuels over time. And the best way to achieve that is to make it very clear that it's going to become a lot more expensive to use fossil fuels.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now, last question for the interview. A hotly debated topic at the moment is the prospect of introducing a wealth tax. While wealth tax sounds appealing to many New Zealanders, mostly because a lot of them wouldn't be affected by it, some researchers and economists claim that it hasn't proven to be effective in other countries because people that tend to be affected by it leave the country and go somewhere else. There were 12 OECD countries which had a wealth tax in 1990, but only 3 of these, Norway, Spain, and Switzerland, have retained them because it didn't work in the other countries. France partially repealed theirs as it drove wealthy out of the country and resulted in a loss of over $2.6 billion. What are your thoughts on this? And in respect of other countries' experience trying to implement this, how feasible or effective do you think it would be in New Zealand?
Yeah, look, the point you've made is a really reasonable one, which is that the challenge with a wealth tax is it presumes that people have no choice but to keep their wealth in the country that imposes the tax. In reality, in countries where wealth taxes have been imposed, the owners of wealth have chosen to take their money out of the country and take it elsewhere, so that actually the country overall is harmed, both because it loses that really important investment that often sustains jobs and businesses, but also because it loses the source of future tax take that those businesses and jobs create. So it's very hard to impose a wealth tax without it actually putting a wrecking ball through the economy as a whole. And I think where a wealth tax sometimes comes from is what I would call a scarcity mindset, which is to say, we've only got this much. The only way I can make you wealthier is to take some from you. I think that's the wrong mindset. Our mindset should be one that says, actually, how can we grow together so that you're better off and so that all of us in New Zealand have better opportunities and better incomes. And absolutely, that includes lifting people out of poverty. But I think we're better to do that by creating better paying jobs, by creating more opportunities, by lifting incomes, by growing our economy. And I think a wealth tax would be very detrimental to all of those things.
In New Zealand, we only have limited tax residency status if we've moved overseas. Somewhere like America, where you essentially have tax residency status for life, it might be a bit easier to implement that. It'd be interesting to see if they ever do that. But I know you are very short on time, and I would like to ask you one more thing very quickly on a lighter note. Can you leave us with the most memorable, surprising, or funny moment you've experienced in Parliament thus far, and bonus points if it's funny?
Well, mine's an embarrassing moment. I certainly amused my own kids in Parliament one day. I meant to ask a very serious question of the Finance Minister, which was to ask him how big the fiscal financial hole in the government's books was. And in an attempt to achieve brevity, I ended up spitting out, how big is his hole? I am eternally grateful that my colleagues across the Parliament saw the lighter side of that and had a good laugh. I just got the giggles, took quite some time to get myself together and correct course. And not only did I come home that night to a 13-year-old who said, how big is your hole? But I've since met a lot of teenagers who know me only as the hole lady.
It might have been embarrassing, but it sounds like it was worth it for comic effect. Well, we have reached the end. I would love to have you back on for more detailed comments when you do have more time, certainly after the elections. But for now, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This has been your hosts, Hayley and Harita, with Nicola Willis on Conversations with Wāhine.
And can I just say a big thank you, Harita and Hayley, for this opportunity and for doing this. I think women supporting women is a very important thing, no matter who you vote for.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.